When the bank teller slid a folded note across the counter and mouthed, "Don't sign anything," I thought she had the wrong person. I was just there to update my direct deposit form. Or so I thought. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start at the bank. It starts 18 months earlier, on the Tuesday morning I buried my husband of 39 years. My name is Barbara Hensley. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in Oakville, Ontario my entire life. My husband, Gerald, died of a massive stroke in February of last year. He was 69, healthy as far as we knew, and had been planning to take me to Newfoundland that summer because I'd always wanted to see the puffins. We never made it to Newfoundland. Instead, I stood in the snow outside St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in a black coat that didn't fit right anymore, and watched them lower the man I'd loved since I was 24 years old into the frozen ground. After Gerald died, my daughter Amy started coming around more. She lived 40 minutes away in Burlington with her husband Troy and their 2 teenagers. Before Gerald passed, we'd see them at Christmas and Thanksgiving, the occasional birthday dinner. But suddenly Amy was calling every day, stopping by on weeknights, offering to drive me to my doctor's appointments, to help me with my grocery shopping, to take a look at my finances because, as she put it, Dad always handled all of that. Didn't he, Mom? She wasn't wrong. Gerald had managed our investments, our RRSP accounts, our bank statements. I knew roughly what we had, roughly what came in and went out each month, but I couldn't have told you the exact figures if you'd asked me. We'd been comfortable. That was the word Gerald always used. We're comfortable, Barb. Meaning we'd paid off the house, had decent savings, had enough to live simply and travel a little in retirement. The house alone, a 4-bedroom detached in Oakville with a finished basement and a backyard, Gerald had spent 20 years landscaping, was worth somewhere close to $1.5 million in today's market. I should have seen what was happening. Looking back now, I can trace every step of it like a trail of breadcrumbs that were right there in front of me, except I was too lonely and too grief-stricken to follow them anywhere. The first warning sign came about 3 months after the funeral. Amy suggested I give her power of attorney over my finances, just temporarily, just to help me get organized. Dad left things a bit complicated, Mom, the investments especially. You shouldn't have to deal with that on your own. She brought over a form from her family lawyer, a man named Douglas Farrell, whose office was in Hamilton. She sat with me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and walked me through it page by page, the way you'd explain something to someone who wasn't quite keeping up. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking, what a good daughter. I signed. The second warning sign came 4 months after that, when Amy mentioned, casually, that it might be worth looking at some residential options. Not nursing homes, she was careful to say. Nothing like that. Independent living communities, Mom. They're beautiful. Active people your age, social events, no maintenance to worry about. Dad would want you to be happy. She brought brochures. Lakeview Gardens in Mississauga, Halton Hills Seniors Village. Places with dining rooms and swimming pools and activity coordinators. I looked at the brochures and then I looked around my kitchen, at the windowsill where Gerald had fixed a small crack in the grout the summer before he died, at the hook by the door where his jacket still hung because I couldn't bring myself to move it, and I told her I wasn't ready for that conversation. She nodded and said, "Of course, Mom, whenever you're ready," and she took the brochures with her when she left. The third warning sign I missed was Troy. Gerald had never liked Troy. He'd been polite about it, the way Gerald was polite about everything. But I'd seen the way his jaw tightened when Troy walked into a room, the way he'd find reasons to step outside when Troy started talking about his various investment ideas, his business connections, his opinions on everything. "That man is always selling something," Gerald told me once. "I just can't figure out what." Troy had started calling me on his own, separate from Amy, which was unusual, asking how I was managing, whether I needed anything, whether I'd thought any more about those community living options. He was warm in the particular way of someone performing warmth, and I caught myself thinking that Gerald had been too hard on him, that Troy had grown into a decent son-in-law, that I'd been unfair. I was wrong. Gerald had been right all along. Here is what I didn't know until a Thursday afternoon in November, when a bank teller named Priya slid a folded note across the counter at the TD branch on Lakeshore Road and changed everything. I'd gone in to update my direct deposit information. My pension from the Halton District School Board, where I'd taught grade 4 for 31 years, was being deposited into an account I wanted to consolidate. I'd brought my ID, my account numbers, the form I'd printed at home. It was a nothing errand, the kind I'd done 100 times. Priya had been helping me for maybe 5 minutes when something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a small stillness, the way someone goes quiet when they've just read something they weren't expecting. She asked me to excuse her for just one moment and went to speak to her manager at the back of the branch. They spoke quietly, glancing at their screen. When she came back, she was composed, professional, but her eyes were doing something her face wasn't. She slid a printed transaction summary toward me, as if showing me something routine. And underneath it, a folded piece of paper. Her fingers rested on it just long enough to make sure I saw it. Then she stepped back and said she'd need a moment to process the form. I unfolded the note under the counter, reading it in my lap like a child hiding a note in class. "Please don't sign anything today. Don't leave yet. My manager is calling someone who can help you. I'm so sorry." My first thought was that she had confused me with someone else. My second thought was the number Priya had briefly shown me on that transaction summary. A number I hadn't expected. A number that was significantly lower than what I'd understood my savings account to contain. I sat very still and waited. The manager, a calm, steady man named David Park, came to sit with me in the small private meeting room off the main floor. He closed the door. He offered me water. And then he told me, gently but without softening it so much that I wouldn't understand, what had been happening to my money. Over the previous 14 months, a series of transfers had been made from my savings and investment accounts into an account I didn't recognize. Small at first, $500, $800, $1,000, then larger, $5,000, $12,000. They were spaced carefully, never quite crossing the thresholds that would trigger automatic fraud alerts. Someone had been deliberate about it. Someone had done research. In total, just over $280,000 had been moved. The account receiving the funds was registered to a numbered company in Troy's name. I heard the words. I understood them. But there was a strange delay between my ears and my brain, as if the information was arriving in a language I almost spoke, but not quite. I kept thinking about the brochures, about Lakeview Gardens in Mississauga, with its dining room and its activity coordinators, about how Amy had said Dad would want you to be happy. What my husband would have wanted was to protect me, and I had handed over the paperwork that made protecting me impossible. David Park told me they had flagged the activity 2 weeks ago and had been in the process of contacting the proper authorities. He told me Priya had recognized my name from the file when I'd walked in that afternoon. He told me the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit had been notified, as had the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, the provincial body that oversees exactly this kind of situation. There were people already working on this, he said. I hadn't walked in alone, even though I hadn't known it yet. He asked if there was someone he could call for me. Someone I trusted. My son. My son, Michael, lived in Calgary with his family. He was Gerald's child in every way that mattered: quiet, steady, the kind of person who thought before he spoke. He and Amy had always had a careful relationship, the sort of distance that develops between siblings who've never quite spoken the same language. When Gerald died, Michael had flown in immediately and stayed for 2 weeks. On the last day before his flight back, he'd sat across from me at this same kitchen table and said, "Mom, if anything ever feels off, you call me before you do anything. Promise me." I'd promised. And then I'd forgotten the promise, or let myself forget, because forgetting was easier than believing anything was wrong. I called Michael from the small private room at the TD branch on Lakeshore Road at 3:15. When I finished telling him what David Park had explained to me, there was a silence on the line that I recognized. It was the silence Gerald used to go silent with when something had made him very, very angry, and he was choosing carefully what to say next. "I'm booking a flight," Michael said. "Don't go home yet. Don't contact Amy or Troy. I'll be there by tomorrow morning." I spent that night in a hotel near the QEW, a quiet place with thick curtains that I kept closed. David Park had arranged for an officer from the Financial Crimes Unit to take my initial statement that evening, a woman named Constable Danielle Tremblay, who had the particular gentleness of someone who has had this conversation many times and has never stopped finding it difficult. She brought coffee in a paper cup and she took notes by hand, and she told me several things I needed to hear. She told me what Amy and Troy had done was a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. Fraud over $5,000, breach of trust. The power of attorney I had signed could be challenged and revoked, and the transfers, because they had been made to a numbered company rather than a personal account, had actually made the paper trail easier to follow, not harder. She told me the OPP had been building a file for the past 2 weeks, and that tonight had accelerated things considerably. She also told me something I hadn't expected. Amy, she said carefully, had not been the one who initiated the scheme. The evidence they had so far pointed to Troy as the primary architect. Amy's role appeared to be one of cooperation. She had signed certain documents, had made certain calls, had facilitated access, but the numbered company was Troy's. The plan was Troy's. Whether Amy had been a full and willing participant or had been manipulated herself was something that would take time to determine. I sat with that for a long time. Because here was the thing about Amy. She had been an anxious child, the kind who needed everyone in the room to be happy before she could relax. She'd married Troy at 26, and I'd watched something in her contract slightly over the years, some easy openness she'd had as a girl slowly replaced by a careful, managed version of herself. Gerald had seen it. I had seen it and told myself it was none of my business, that marriages were private, that Amy was an adult who made her own choices. I had not asked the hard questions, because I hadn't wanted to know the hard answers. Now I wondered what Amy's hard answers might be. Michael arrived at 7 the next morning, coming straight from Pearson Airport in a taxi with his carry-on still in his hand. He walked into the hotel lobby, and when he saw me, he didn't say anything, just wrapped both arms around me and held on. I had not cried since the night before, had been too shocked and too tired and too careful to cry, but I cried then, into my son's shoulder, in the lobby of a Holiday Inn off the QEW, while a man at the check-in desk pretended not to notice. We spent the next 3 days doing nothing but talking to people, Constable Tremblay and her supervisor, a lawyer named Roberta Fonseca who specialized in elder financial abuse and who turned out to be one of the sharpest people I'd ever met, the kind of person who listens with her entire body and makes you feel that your situation, as terrible as it is not beyond fixing. The Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee sent a representative named Claude Bissonnette, who explained the process of revoking the power of attorney and installing a neutral trustee while the investigation was ongoing. And Priya Anand, the bank teller who had recognized my name and folded that note, met with us briefly on the second day off the clock, on her lunch break, just to make sure I was all right. I asked her why she'd done it. Slid the note. Broken protocol, really, or at least bent it considerably. She was young, maybe 28, with careful eyes and a long braid over one shoulder. My mother's aunt went through something similar, she said. Lost her savings in 3 years, everything she and her husband had built. The family didn't find out until there was nothing left to recover. She paused. I saw your name on the file 2 weeks ago, and I kept thinking, if she comes in, I'll find a way. She looked at me steadily. You came in. That is the thing about the people who save you. They're not waiting to be heroes. They're just paying attention when everyone else has stopped. Troy was arrested on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after that afternoon at the bank. Michael and I heard about it from Roberta, who called us while we were eating breakfast at my kitchen table. I had gone home by then. The house released back to me once investigators had documented what they needed from Gerald's old office, where Troy had apparently been given access on multiple occasions. The charge was fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal breach of trust. Bail was set and he posted it, which meant he was out within 48 hours, a fact that made me feel sick until Roberta reminded me that the evidence against him was extensive and the Crown's case was strong. Amy called me that same day. I let it go to voicemail. She called twice more before Michael gently took the phone from my hand and set it face down on the table. Not yet, Mom, he said. Not until you're ready. And maybe not until we know more about what she knew. I didn't know how to explain to him what I was feeling about Amy because I hadn't sorted it out myself. It wasn't the clean, cold anger I felt toward Troy, who had come into our family under false pretenses and used my grief as a financial opportunity. What I felt about my daughter was something murkier and harder to name, a sadness that kept shifting shape. Anger, yes, but also a terrible, helpless pity. And underneath both of those, a mother's instinct that doesn't dissolve even when it probably should. It took 4 more weeks before I was ready to speak to her. Michael was still in Oakville, having extended his leave from his firm in Calgary. We met Amy at Roberta's office, on neutral ground, with Roberta present. Amy came alone. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, which she probably hadn't. She sat across from me with her hands in her lap and she told me everything. She had known about the transfers from the beginning. Troy had told her they were borrowing against my assets temporarily, that the investment he was making would return 3 times the amount within a year, and he'd put it all back before I noticed. She had believed him, or had chosen to believe him, which she understood now was not the same thing. When the returns hadn't materialized, when she'd pushed Troy for answers, he'd told her it was too late to stop, that if she said anything she'd be implicated too, that no one would believe she hadn't known and approved everything from the start, and so she had stayed quiet. She had kept calling me every day. She had kept driving me to my doctor's appointments. She had looked me in the face every week for 14 months while her husband emptied my accounts. "I was a coward," she said. The words fell flat and factual in the air of the conference room. "I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it." "What are you asking?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. I didn't forgive her that day. I want to be clear about that, because stories like this sometimes get tidied up at the end into reconciliations that didn't really happen, or didn't happen the way they're described. What I did was decide that I wasn't going to let what Troy had done to both of us be the only thing that defined our relationship going forward. That was different from forgiveness. It was more like leaving a door slightly ajar. What happened next was up to her. Amy filed for divorce from Troy 7 weeks later. She cooperated fully with the Crown's case, providing documentation, emails, records of conversations she had screenshotted and saved in the 14 months she had known and done nothing. Her cooperation did not immunize her from consequences. She received a conditional sentence and a period of supervised probation, which Roberta had advised me to expect and to accept as fair, given the full picture. It was fair. I believed that, even when it was hard to. Troy's trial took 9 months. Gerald's old kitchen table became a kind of command center for me during that period, covered in folders, statements, printouts that Roberta sent me to review. Michael came back from Calgary for every significant court date. Constable Tremblay texted me updates when she was able to. Priya sent me a card when the verdict came in. Guilty. Fraud over $5,000. Breach of trust. Troy received 4 years in a federal institution, minus time served. $260,000 of the $280,000 transferred had been recovered. The remainder was gone, spent on what the Crown described as speculative investments that had never materialized. Roberta had warned me not to expect full recovery, and so I had prepared myself for that number, had made my peace with the portion that was simply gone. You might think that losing over $20,000 permanently would feel devastating. After everything else, it felt almost trivial. What I had nearly lost was my house, my independence, my legal identity as a competent adult capable of managing her own life. Against that, $20,000 was nothing. It was a number on a page. What the trial gave me was not the money. It was my name back. I am 67 years old. I live in the same house in Oakville where I raised my children and landscaped the backyard with my husband and cracked the grout on the kitchen windowsill and fixed it badly the following summer. I know my account balances to the dollar. I have a financial advisor named James who sends me a monthly summary and calls me if anything looks unusual, not because I can't understand the numbers, but because we agreed that a second pair of eyes is simply good practice. I have Roberta's number in my phone. I have Priya's too, though she has since moved to a different branch. Michael comes back to Oakville every few months, and last summer he brought his kids, my grandchildren, to see the house and sleep in the rooms their father had grown up in. We ate dinner on the back porch, and his youngest asked if I was going to grow puffins in the garden, having overheard some conversation she'd half understood, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my iced tea. Gerald would have loved that evening. Amy and I see each other. Not easily and not often and not in the way we used to. But she came for dinner in March, and she sat at the kitchen table without her husband for the first time in 20 years, and she seemed, underneath the careful composure she was working hard to maintain, like someone who was slowly learning to take up slightly more space. We talked about the kids, about her new apartment in Burlington, about a watercolor class she'd joined. We did not talk about Troy. We did not talk about the 14 months. There would be time for those conversations, or there wouldn't be, but that evening we needed something simpler. I think about Priya often. I've thought about what it means that a young woman I'd never met, working a Thursday afternoon shift at a bank branch, paid enough attention to fold a piece of paper and slide it across a counter at exactly the right moment. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because someone had failed to do it for her family once, and she had decided that was not going to happen on her watch. That is such a small decision when you describe it that way. It is also the reason I still live in my house. I volunteer now with a program through Halton Region called Financial Safety for Seniors. We run workshops at community centers and libraries, helping older adults understand how to read their own account statements, what power of attorney documents actually mean before you sign them, what the early signs of financial exploitation look like. I know those signs now by heart. I also know how easy they are to miss when the person holding the pen is someone you love. The thing I tell people, the thing I wish someone had told me, is this. Protecting yourself from the people who might exploit you does not mean trusting no one. It means staying inside your own life. It means reading your own statements, understanding your own documents, keeping at least one set of eyes yours on every account that carries your name. Gerald handled our finances with complete integrity for 39 years, and because of that, I had let myself become someone who didn't know her own numbers. That wasn't his fault. It wasn't a flaw in our marriage. It was just a gap. And gaps, when grief moves in, can become doorways for people who are watching for exactly that kind of opening. I know my numbers now, every one of them. And I keep Gerald's jacket on the hook by the door because I haven't decided yet whether I'm ready to move it, and because the choice is mine to make. So if you're watching this from somewhere in Canada or anywhere else where this story landed close to home, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where something felt off and you talked yourself out of paying attention to it? I think most of us have. Share it in the comments if you're willing. You never know who might need to read exactly what you have to say.